Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another first boot ranking. This time we're talking about Australian Survivor. Now this will obviously be limited to only the Network 10 seasons, which we do have 8 people to rank here. Now I should also clarify that for me, the first boot is the person that was the first person voted out of the game, and for Australian Survivor, there's only one unique case here, and that is with the most recent season, Heroes vs. Villains, with Jackie being medevaced from the game before Anjali's vote out. They'll be considering Anjali as the first boot here instead of Jackie, because again, she was formally voted out of the game. But with that, let's get into the ranking itself. Again, we have 8 players to rank here, so let's start off at number 8. The worst first boot in the history of Australian Survivor, to me, is the person I think did the most actively bad to lead up to their eventual boot, and that person is Matt DYSON from Champions vs. Contenders 1. And for me, Matt is the only actively bad first boot here. Actually, when I was looking at the first boots from Australian Survivor, I was actually surprised to see that none of these people outside of Matt are actually that bad. But Matt is someone that I do feel largely does it to himself, where coming into this round, he was not supposed to be the first boot. Steve was the person that was looked at as a consensus first boot target, though it seemed like Matt's paranoia really got to him to the point where he did get the votes put on him. Now, I also will say that at the end of the day, Matt was not in a good position to begin with, so I do think there is reason to be paranoid, but the way that he handles the entire situation is completely wrong, the way it causes him to eventually be voted out due to his own paranoia. And to me, he is the only first boot in Australian Survivor to really just actively do it to himself in a position where he should have been safe, and because that, for me, he is the most actively bad first boot here, and putting him at the bottom of the list. Now, number 7, we're moving on to first boot. This is someone that I don't really think had much of a chance no matter what season they were on, and while they do have a couple social faux pas and probably still one of the worst players in Australian Survivor, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that he wouldn't have had much of a chance on most seasons, and that person is Dez from the first season, from AU 2016. The first boot ever. And I mean, Dez is someone that I would kind of lump into the likes of a Sonia Christopher or Jim Lynch. These people on my Survivor US first boot ranking that I just don't think really had much of a chance to begin with. However, I feel like a slight difference is I do think Dez is a bit more abrasive of figure on the tribe. I do feel like he is someone that could get into more conflict, and we do see him fighting with Kat on his way out, and obviously that's bad. Though again, I just think he was kind of screwed to begin with. So in comparison to Matt, again, I think Matt was someone that was in an okay spot at one point and then actively ruined it. Dez was never in a good spot, and again did do a little bit wrong here and there, but was never really going to survive anyway. So because that, he is not as bad, and he is here number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to a first boot that is probably the most baseline first boot on the list here. I feel like the top 5 are actually all pretty solid first boots in the fact that I think they all have major things to prop them up. However, I don't really have anything to prop this person up, but also nothing to really demerit them too much either. So at number 6, I do have ANASTASIA from Champions Contenders 2, and ANASTASIA again is largely fine. I mean, she kind of gives me Katrina Radke vibes if we're comparing it to Survivor US, of a player that again didn't really blend in with their tribe, but also doesn't do that much actively wrong either. She just felt kind of an outlier on her tribe, and even then, I mean, there were talks about using her to make a big move on the sporty group on the tribe, and while it doesn't go through, again, there were talks about her being in an alliance. So again, I really don't think Anastasia's that bad. I just don't feel like there's anything out of the norm to really prop her up for, unlike literally the remaining 5 people on the list, which kind of shows you how wonky the first boots on Australian Survivor are. But again, with that, ANASTASIA lands here number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to the most recent Australian Survivor first boot, and that is ANJALI from Heroes vs. Villains. And ANJALI is someone that in many ways is kind of in the same tier as ANASTASIA. Seemed to be someone that was taken out partially due to physical strength, partially due to certain connections she had with Jackie and George, though at the same time gets extremely unlucky in the game. And that is the reason why she's above ANASTASIA for me, where well, yes, she does make kind of a dumb decision in agreeing to go along with the vote, was kind of aloof in her social standing to where she assumed that Steve was going to be taken out over her, but still probably wasn't going to be the primary target if it wasn't for Jackie's medevac, where there was talk about voting out Jackie instead of her. And also, if George was eligible to be there too, I do think George could have potentially been in danger too. And I do feel like ANJALI is largely taken out due to the other people in her alliance not being there. And that's also a thing of like her allies are literally gone. So I do think that's a lot of unlucky circumstances for her, but I do feel like she also does play pretty actively bad after those unlucky circumstances. That puts her towards the bottom of these players I do think have a bit more merit to them, but still isn't bad entirely, and because that she's here at number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on to a very interesting first boot, and one that I didn't really know what to do with, considering I always found this person's elimination to be a very wonky one, and that person is Joan from Australian Survivor 2017. And yeah, this has always been a very strange vote to me, where like I don't even understand what actually happened here, where Joan is someone that I always expected to be a relatively early boot. Again, like I think if it wasn't for the fact that she comes very close to staying, she probably would be around the Anastasia part of the list. However, I kind of have her in a tier above because she comes very close to staying. She gets a 6-6 vote for her to where she ends up being taken out on the revote. But again, like the fact that she had 6 people vote with her is kind of insane. And like, again, I don't fully get why. Like I know that Luke is Luke, and he wanted to make a big move, and he thought getting rid of Kent would weaken the other side, though this plan always seemed like super short-sighted to me. But considering the fact that it is a move that benefits Joan, and she does come extremely close to staying, where she's only 1 vote away from staying in the game, something that no other first boot in Australian Survivor has, to me that was enough to rate her higher here, even though I still don't fully understand the overall dynamics that led to that. But again, still enough for me to land her here at number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to a first boot that I feel like a lot of people were very low on this player when they were the first boot, but I really feel like a lot of them being the first boot was due to a lot of pre-game stigmas. And at number 3, we do have Andy from Blood vs. Water. Obviously, Andy was a returning player on that season. And while, yes, the edit shows him being this like domineering figure and one that gets taken out due to being too domineering, like I don't actually feel like that's the reason why he was taken out. I do feel like a lot of the reason why he was actually taken out was due to his pregame stigma from his first time around, where obviously through watching that, he comes off as a very untrustworthy player, one that's constantly shifting alliances. And I feel like the fact that he does come off as someone that isn't a good ally is more of a reason why he was taken out to begin with. So again, to me, I do look at that as a very wonky situation, a situation where he's voted out due to things kind of outside of his control, at least under the sense of the individual game that we're talking about. And because that, for me, I do land him here at number 3. Now, number 2, we're moving on to someone that obviously always had to be really high here. The other returning player on the board, we do have the first boot from Australian Survivor All-Stars. We have Shane Gould. And again, like Shane is essentially in the Tina Wesson spot for Australian Survivor here, of a former winner that came back on All-Stars and was the first boot from their tribe. Now, I will say that I don't think the anti-winner sentiment was as strong as it was for Tina Wesson. However, I do feel like it definitely didn't help Shane here, and then with Shane also not being the most physical competitor in the world, especially at this time in her life, like it definitely was just a very clear recipe for her being an early boot, but one that she didn't really have much of an opportunity to get out of. Now, in some ways, I could see her being lumped in with the likes of Dez, where I feel like they are similar styles of first boots. However, I think considering Shane's legacy coming into the season as a former winner, it does obviously have to bolster her on the list. Especially considering in this situation, there were still people that wanted to try to keep her around. It just obviously didn't go through. So again, for me, I do feel like despite the fact that this anti-winner sentiment wasn't as strong here as it is in Tina Wesson's case, I do feel like it's enough to where I would rank her similarly on the list at number 2 here. Now, number 1, the best first boot in Australian Survivor history ends up coming from a player that was so massively screwed over that I have them higher than the returning players that had stigmas against them coming into their seasons. And at number 1, I obviously have to have Phil from Brains vs. Brawn. And again, Phil was just screwed. I mean, Phil came into the first tribal feeling completely safe. And there should have been no way that Phil was going home here, with no one really talking about them as a target, though because of the twist of this first week of George getting the power to send half the tribe back to camp and in essence giving them immunity while also taking them out of the potential vote and also ending up saving the other potential easy boots there, it leaves Phil in a position where it's them versus a lot of the stronger people on the tribe, to where they look like the least physical of the bunch. And we're looking at a group of people that contains Mitch, we got Joey, we got Andrew, Haley, Laura, and these are all some of the better competitors on the Brains tribe, and for Phil to be left with them just really leaves them as a pretty easy target with no real time to plead their case either. I mean, Phil was just massively screwed over on this season, really having no real chance to stay here, and because I feel like they're easily the most screwed over first boot in the history of Australian Survivor, and possibly in the history of just Survivor in general. The only downside from a more global standpoint is the fact that Phil at least genuinely got voted out, or people made the decisions for themselves to vote them out, which would probably put them a spot below someone like Johnny Fairplay. But outside of that, Phil's easily one of the most screwed over players on the board here, and because of that, they're here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that's my ranking of every first boot in Australian Survivor history. Another ranking in the books. Obviously, you can expect similar content from the channel moving forward, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.